Capitol Hill. Under the blinding lights, Jasmine Crockett faces Marjorie Taylor Greene over a $120,000 hospital bill and 40 years of unpaid justice. One man's life, one nation's promise, and one explosive recording are about to collide. In just 46 seconds, the room will decide who serves power and who serves the people. But when the truth hits this hard, can anyone still walk away untarnished? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber was full, every seat taken, the air tight with tension. Lights poured straight down on the table like a boxing ring, shadows cutting hard lines across the floor. Jasmine Crockett stepped in, navy suit crisp, her gaze sharp but steady, every movement controlled. Across the room, a door swung open. Marjorie Taylor Greene entered in a blazing red jacket, a smirk carved into her face, a thick stack of papers clutched like a weapon. The moderator's voice hit the air, clear and deliberate. Tonight's topic, health insurance and the right to medical care. They sat facing each other, still as statues, eyes locked. Jasmine radiated calm focus, the weight of real people behind her. MTG leaned forward, posture coiled, her energy all attack. Two women, two colors, two worlds, about to collide under the lights. The air between them seemed to thicken in that pause after the introductions, the kind of pause that makes the lights feel hotter and the walls closer. The moderator's voice had barely faded when MTG leaned forward, as if she couldn't wait another second to throw the first punch. Her elbows planted on the table, shoulders squared, she angled her chin toward Jasmine like a predator lining up a clean shot. The microphone caught the edge in her voice before the words themselves landed. "Ms. Crockett," she began, slow and deliberate, letting the name sit there just long enough to frame what was coming next. "You don't understand a thing about budgets." She didn't pause for breath. "You just hand out money to people who don't deserve it." The words came heavier, slower, the kind meant to bruise and linger. Then, with a faint tilt of her head and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she delivered another cut. "You've never run a real business in your life. You think tax dollars are a charity fund for your friends?" Her tone wasn't just condescending. It was sharpened, designed to slice through the air and lodge itself in the minds of anyone predisposed to believe it. It was a classic political trap. Inject a loaded phrase, feed the bias, then let the target scramble to defend themselves. The effect rippled instantly. In the rows behind them, a few heads tilted forward, eyes narrowing in quiet agreement. Others frowned, their focus bouncing between the two women, measuring the hit. One man in a gray suit murmured something under his breath to the woman next to him, his gaze fixed on Jasmine like he expected her to flinch. But she didn't, not even a blink. Jasmine sat motionless, her breathing steady, her posture as precise as it had been when she walked in. If anything, the corners of her eyes sharpened, not in anger, but in focus, like a chess player watching an opponent open with the exact move she'd hoped for. MTG's smirk deepened, mistaking stillness for hesitation. She shifted slightly in her chair, ready to follow up, but stopped when Jasmine's hand moved. It wasn't fast. It was the opposite. Her fingers slid across the polished wood, slow and deliberate, until they rested on the red folder in front of her. The room seemed to notice at the same time. Even the cameraman tracking the exchange instinctively zoomed in, framing the flash of crimson under the spotlight. Jasmine's thumb pressed lightly against the edge, and with a subtle motion, she lifted the cover just enough for the paper inside to shift with a faint, clean sound. It wasn't enough to show anything. It didn't have to be. That single, precise movement spoke louder than any rebuttal could have in that moment. It was a signal, clear, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. MTG's eyes flicked to it for less than a second, but that was all it took. The predator's posture faltered, the smirk paused in place. For the first time, her expression read, not as attack, but calculation, trying to guess what was inside, how much it could hurt, and when Jasmine might decide to unleash it. Jasmine didn't speak. She let the weight of the moment hang there, her hand resting lightly on the folder, her gaze never leaving MTG's face. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. "You wanted to start here? Fine. But I decide how it ends. Under the harsh, unwavering lights of the chamber, Jasmine's chair slid back with a low, deliberate scrape that cut through the air like a warning. The sound was small, but it carried, sharp enough to pull every wandering gaze back to her. She rose slowly, the movement unhurried but full of intent, her posture straight, her shoulders set. This wasn't an impulsive reaction. It was the beginning of something she had come prepared to do. Her right hand reached forward, fingers closing around a single sheet of paper from the desk. The white page caught the light immediately, stark and cold, its black ink standing out in bold, merciless clarity. At the top, in print, large enough for the front rows to read, was a figure that hit like a punch. $120,000. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a report. It was a hospital bill. Jasmine held it up high enough for the cameras to capture, her grip firm, her eyes scanning the room as if daring anyone to look away. Her voice came low at first, steady but resonant. "This," she said, "is the medical bill of a 67-year-old American citizen." She let the words sink in for a beat, the silence around her making them heavier. "He was denied coverage," she continued, her tone sharpening, "despite paying his insurance premiums for 40 years. Then she stopped speaking for half a second, her eyes locking with those in the audience, challenging, measuring. When she spoke again, her voice was slower, heavier, carrying the weight of a verdict. This man served his country and was abandoned when he needed it most. Every syllable was deliberate, each one landing like the drop of a gavel. The paper in her hand did not tremble. It was steady, defiant, almost weapon-like. And in that charged stillness, it became more than just a bill. It became proof, a tangible betrayal that no one in the room could pretend not to see. The chamber didn't react all at once. First came the stillness, the collective intake of breath. Then small shifts. A man in the second row leaning forward, squinting at the page as if to confirm the number. A woman lowering her eyes, shaking her head slowly. Two others exchanging glances that said they understood exactly what this meant. And through it all, Jasmine stood there, the paper raised, her presence filling the space more completely than any raised voice could have. The chamber was still holding the echo of Jasmine's last words when MTG jerked her body forward, closing the inches to her microphone like a boxer stepping into a punch. Her eyes narrowed into sharp slits, the corners of her mouth twitching as if the insult had been loaded in the chamber for weeks. "That's a made-up story. Don't do theater here." The words cracked out like a gunshot, quick, sharp, meant to stun. There was nothing soft in them, no hesitation, no humanity, just the cold, flat force of someone trying to wrench the spotlight back onto their own terms. A murmur rippled through the rows. Some leaned back as if recoiling, others leaned in as though sensing blood in the water. A man in the second row shifted in his seat, arms crossed tight, eyes narrowing. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't even lean into her mic. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward the tech crew at the back of the room and gave a single, measured nod. It was a small gesture, but in the tension of that moment, it felt like pulling a trigger. A low hum swelled overhead as the projectors came alive. The house lights dropped just enough for the focus to shift to the wall behind them. The big screen flared to life. Not a graph, not a statistic. Video, high definition, full color. MTG stood at a podium in a town hall, the backdrop marked with her campaign insignia. Her hair was perfect, her blazer immaculate, her smile broad and confident. The crowd in the footage leaned forward, locked in, ready to cheer. Then the audio hit, her own voice ringing through the chamber, steady and assured. "We will fix this system so that no one would be left behind." The clarity was perfect, not grainy, not distorted. There was no mistaking it for anything but reality. The sentence echoed off the chamber walls, landing heavier now than it likely had the day she said it. Jasmine didn't let the silence stretch too far. She leaned toward her mic, her voice cutting clean through the stillness. "This is your voice, MTG. You remember, don't you?" The words were calm, but they landed like a blade pressed to the throat. Not screaming, not rushed, just undeniable. MTG's posture faltered. Her shoulders rose slightly, her eyes darting from side to side, searching for a way out. She opened her mouth once, a short intake of breath as if to reply, but no words followed. The screen froze on a still frame of her mid-promise. Hand raised, smile wide, eyes fixed on an unseen supporter in the past. In the audience, the air seemed to thicken. A woman in the third row shook her head slowly, lips pressing into a thin, hard line. Beside her, a man's eyes stayed locked on MTG, his expression somewhere between disbelief and recognition. MTG's fingers found the stack of papers before her, shuffling and straightening them like that small act might restore her footing. But the image on the wall behind her loomed larger than any stack of talking points. And across from her, Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just let the weight of the proof sit there, filling the room until it was all anyone could hear, see, or think about. The weight of Jasmine's proof still hung heavy in the chamber. It wasn't just the image on the big screen anymore. It was the way it had stripped the room of any sound but breathing, the way it had pinned MTG in her chair. But then, like a sudden crack of thunder in a quiet storm, MTG lurched forward toward the mic, her voice pitched high, sharp, and urgent. Everyone knows politics is about budget priorities. She hit the words hard, almost shouting, as if sheer volume could bury what had just been shown. The line ricocheted off the chamber walls, bouncing back into the air, thick with tension. A few heads in the audience turned toward her, startled by the sudden rise in her tone. One or two leaned back in their seats as though to avoid the spray of desperation. But Jasmine didn't move, her eyes fixed on MTG with an intensity that didn't need to match the volume. It carried its own force. She didn't rush to interrupt. She didn't even raise her chin. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and even, but so sharp it seemed to slice through the noise. Then let's talk about your priorities. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The lights didn't change, but the shadows felt deeper, the air thicker. Jasmine leaned in just enough to bring her mouth closer to the microphone, not in aggression, but in precision, like a marksman adjusting their aim before pulling the trigger. And then it began. Her voice stayed steady, almost unnervingly calm, as she started naming the first of the three healthcare bills MTG had voted against. She gave the bill number, the date, the summary, and then the consequence. Funding stripped from 42 rural hospitals, she said, resulting in the closure of 6 facilities in counties where the nearest alternative was over 100 miles away. The number hung there for a beat before she moved on, her tone not rising, not falling, just hammering forward. The second bill came next. Denied expansion of emergency care subsidies, Jasmine continued, directly impacting 83 community clinics and contributing to a documented rise in preventable deaths. Her cadence was slow enough for each fact to land, but tight enough to leave no room for interruption. MTG shifted in her seat. By the time Jasmine reached the third bill, the chamber was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Voted against the Rural Health Lifeline Act, she said, cutting off federal grants that provided life-saving treatment to over 200,000 uninsured Americans. She didn't stop there. She gave the number of those who had died as a direct result of losing access to care. It wasn't a round number. It was exact, unflinching, ugly in its precision. All the while, her delivery never wavered. It was the kind of even, relentless rhythm that wasn't trying to win a debate. It was laying down the record, piece by piece, until the weight of it became unbearable. It was 46 seconds of pure pressure, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice because it knows the truth is heavier than any insult. The air between them became a tight wire, stretched and humming. Jasmine's eyes never left MTG's, even as she read off the data. It wasn't the look of someone merely calling out a lie. It was the look of someone pressing a hand to the exact wound they knew would make their opponent flinch. And flinch MTG did. At first it was subtle, the faint tightening of her jaw, the twitch of a muscle near her temple. Then came the shift in posture, her back pressing into the chair as if to create space that wasn't there. Beads of sweat began forming at her hairline, catching the light in sharp, humiliating glints. She tried to keep her mouth in that practiced half-smile, but with every sentence Jasmine delivered, it faltered a little more. By the 30-second mark, the corners had flattened. By the final words, it was gone entirely. Somewhere in the audience, a cough broke the silence. Not loud, but loud enough to remind MTG that the room was still watching, still measuring, still taking in every moment of her unraveling. Jasmine closed her statement with no change in tone, no triumphant flourish. She simply stopped speaking, letting the silence reclaim the chamber. And in that silence, the contrast was stark. Jasmine steady, still, eyes unwavering. MTG shifting in her chair, skin glistening under the lights, her smirk a memory. For 46 seconds, the balance of the room had been entirely one-sided, and everyone knew it. Under the heat of the lights, the chamber still trembled with the echo of Jasmine's relentless 46-second strike. The weight of it hadn't lifted. Eyes were still on her, breath still shallow, and MTG sat stiff in her chair, the remnants of a smile gone from her face. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, didn't rush her words. She didn't need to. She leaned in slightly toward the microphone, her posture steady, her gaze locked with surgical precision on the woman across from her. "Do you remember the call on March 14th last year?" The question landed like a dropped blade, quiet, sharp, and deadly. It wasn't just a question. It was an opening move in a play no one else in the room had seen coming. For a fraction of a second, MTG's eyes flickered, a barely there tightening around the edges, as if her body knew before her mind could catch up that something dangerous was about to happen. Jasmine didn't give her the chance to respond. With the same unhurried precision she'd carried all night, she reached down to the table and set a small black recorder in front of her. The object was unremarkable in size, but in that moment, it drew the focus of the entire room. Every camera lens in the chamber tilted toward it like it was a live grenade. Her hand didn't leave the device right away. Instead, she kept her palm resting on top of it for a beat, letting the suspense coil tighter. Then, click. The recorder came alive with a tiny whir, the red light blinking once before holding steady. A second later, the first sound emerged. It wasn't static. It wasn't muffled. It was a voice, clear, crisp, undeniable. MTG's voice. "I don't care about those sick old men. They didn't vote for me." The line didn't just land, it detonated. The reaction was instant and visceral. Gasps erupted in overlapping bursts, bouncing off the high walls. A few were sharp and short, others drawn out like the air had been punched from someone's lungs. In the front rows, two lawmakers instinctively brought their hands to their faces, covering their eyes as though the words themselves were too ugly to watch. An aide in the far corner froze mid-step, a folder clutched to his chest, his mouth hanging slightly open. Another turned her gaze down to the floor, shaking her head slowly, as though trying to reconcile the sound with the woman sitting only feet away. And in the middle of it all, MTG went pale. The kind of pale that isn't just skin deep, but drains from somewhere deeper, where confidence lives. Her lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. Her eyes darted once toward the screen, once toward the door, then back to Jasmine, searching for something to grab onto. There was nothing. The sound of her own voice was still hanging in the air, replaying in the heads of everyone present, sealing off any escape. Then all at once she snapped. "That's fake! She's trying to ruin me!" MTG's voice cracked, higher now, pushing out the words in a burst of panic. But the room didn't move, didn't murmur in agreement, didn't even seem to hear her in any meaningful way. The proof was too loud. Her protest fell into the void, swallowed by the reality everyone had just witnessed. The recorder kept playing that one sentence in their minds over and over without needing to loop. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even blink more than necessary. The camera zoomed in tight on her face, and what they caught wasn't triumph. It was something heavier, sharper. Her eyes burned with a controlled fury, not the heat of personal revenge, but the deep, steady fire of someone standing exactly where justice had brought her. The red light on the recorder glowed steady, a silent witness on the table between them. It didn't need to flash, didn't need to speak. It was simply there. Proof that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or twisted into spin. That 10-inch stretch of plastic and metal now held the weight of the entire exchange. In the rows behind, the murmurs started to die down, replaced by a heavier quiet. This wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of recognition. Everyone in the chamber knew what they had just heard, and there was no unhearing it. A few people's expressions shifted, not toward Jasmine, but toward MTG. Expressions that said, without a single word, "You said that. You own it." MTG's hands, which had been resting stiffly on the table, moved now. She touched the edge of the papers in front of her, then let them go. Then clasped her hands together, fingers tightening as if holding on to herself was the only thing left to hold on to. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the audience. Her gaze flicked toward the recorder one last time before sliding away, unable to hold on. Jasmine sat there, motionless except for the subtle rise and fall of her breathing. The contrast between the two women was stark, one anchored, unshaken, the other visibly searching for footing on ground that had been ripped out from under her. The truth was out, and the room could feel its shape in the air. This wasn't a moment that would pass when the next speaker took the mic. This was a moment that had lodged itself into the spine of the hearing, a fracture that would remain visible no matter what came next. And still, Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't need to. The proof had spoken in a voice clearer than any closing statement could ever be. The red light on the recorder was still glowing like a live coal on the table when the moderator straightened in his seat and reached for the microphone. The sharp rap of the gavel cracked through the chamber, a sound meant to reassert control, to drag the room back into some semblance of procedural order. "Order! Order, please!" he called out, his voice firm but lacking the weight it had carried earlier in the session. It was clear to everyone that whatever control he thought he could reclaim was already gone. The air itself had shifted, the current of the hearing flowing in a new direction, away from MTG and toward Jasmine. It was in the way people leaned now. Lawmakers who had been slouched back minutes ago were sitting forward, elbows on the table, their eyes fixed on Jasmine like she'd become the gravitational center of the room. Staffers who had been rifling through notes earlier were now perfectly still, listening. The audience in the gallery had changed too. No more restless glances at phones or whispered side conversations. Now they were locked in, faces reflecting a mix of shock, grudging respect, and the sharp focus of people watching something irreversible take place. In the second row, two members of MTG's own political faction exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. One leaned in toward the other, shielding his mouth with his hand as he murmured just loudly enough for the words to carry to a few nearby ears. "This is over." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't shouted, but it was absolute. The sentence seemed to move like a slow ripple across the chamber, whispered and repeated under breaths, each time picking up more certainty. By the time it reached the far corner, it had transformed from an observation into a verdict. The moderator tried again, tapping the mic twice, his tone sharper. "Let's maintain order." But it was futile. The authority in his voice was hollow now, an echo trying to compete with the truth that had already filled the room. People weren't responding to his command. They were responding to the presence of Jasmine, to the unshakable calm she projected in the wake of the explosion she had just set off. She didn't press forward with another attack. She didn't rise from her seat to deliver a final blow. She didn't need to. Jasmine simply sat there, her back straight, her hands folded loosely in front of her, her breathing steady and unhurried. Her eyes remained level, neither daring nor taunting, but fixed with the quiet assurance of someone who knew the work was already done. Every second she stayed silent made the silence more powerful. Across the dais, the movement was subtle but telling. A handful of lawmakers, who earlier had been angled toward MTG, now shifted their bodies ever so slightly toward Jasmine. Folders and briefing documents were turned her way instead of toward their usual ally. It wasn't a dramatic defection, not yet, but it was enough to make clear where the wind was blowing. The small betrayals were happening in plain sight. The reporters in the back, who had been scribbling notes in bursts, now slowed down. They knew they weren't just covering a hearing anymore. They were witnessing the hinge point in a story that would be replayed and dissected for weeks. Cameras adjusted focus, lenses tracking every tiny movement of Jasmine's face, every flicker of expression that might be read as a signal. Still, Jasmine didn't give them one. She wasn't performing for the press, and she wasn't chasing the energy in the room. She understood the difference between a victory taken and a victory given freely by those who had just changed their minds. She knew the truth had weight, and weight didn't need to shout to crush. In the gallery, there was a hum of shifting positions, not just physical, but mental. People who had walked in prepared to doubt her were now sitting in the same posture as her allies. There was no applause, no overt acknowledgement. That would have broken the spell. But the tilt in the air was impossible to miss. Jasmine had become the fixed point, the anchor, while MTG's chair now seemed to sit on unstable ground. The moderator's eyes darted between them, his gavel idle in his hand now. He could feel it too, that the center of authority in the room had moved, and it no longer belonged to the one with the title or the one with the loudest voice. It belonged to the one who had laid down the truth and then let it speak for itself. Jasmine breathed in slowly, then exhaled, the smallest shift in her posture relaxing her shoulders by a fraction. She knew when to push and when to let gravity do the rest. And now gravity was working in her favor. The evidence she'd put on the table was still there, still glowing in the minds of everyone present. No counter-argument had erased it, no denial had blunted it. Around her the air carried the weight of a verdict not yet spoken, but already decided. She could feel it in the way the room moved, how heads turned more often toward her than toward the dais, how whispered side comments leaned in her direction, how the silence seemed to hum with a shared understanding. The truth had landed, and it wasn't going anywhere. And so she sat, letting that truth settle like dust after a building falls, knowing that every second she remained still was another second her opponent was left alone in the rubble. The silence Jasmine had chosen to hold, heavy, earned, and absolute, still gripped the chamber when she turned slightly toward the gallery. A quiet pivot that said the argument had shifted from politics to people. And in that breath between motions, she gestured to the sergeant-at-arms to clear a path as she addressed the man whose bill had just pierced the room, inviting him forward with a calm nod that carried more authority than any raised voice. While lawmakers leaned in, cameras adjusted their focus, and the moderator's gavel, now idle, rested useless against the wood. He rose carefully from the aisle seat, a 67-year-old with steady pride fighting a tremor in his hands. The paper that had been held up minutes ago now clutched against his chest like proof and wound at the same time. He moved down the narrow steps with small, careful strides, one hand skimming the rail, his jacket a little worn at the cuffs, his shoes making soft, deliberate sounds that seemed far louder than they should under the bright house lights. And as he reached the floor, an aide drew a standing mic nearer, while another pulled a spare chair up behind him in case his legs failed, though his spine stayed straight as he approached Jasmine. Up close, the bill looked even harsher, creased from being folded, the ink of $120,000, bold and unforgiving, the dates and codes running like a cold ledger of pain. Yet the man's face held something different from anger. It was the tired steadiness of someone who has worked a lifetime and now finds himself explaining the obvious. And the lenses found every detail. The pale ridge of a healed scar near his temple, the silver at his hairline, the calluses that spoke of years with tools, the deep lines that come from laughter and sun, and not nearly enough sleep when a family needed him to do one more double shift. Jasmine eased the microphone down to his height and stepped aside half a pace, close enough to steady the stand with a palm if it wobbled, far enough to give him the space that dignity requires. Her eyes softening only at the edges while her posture stayed iron straight, and behind them the big screen remained dark. No charts or graphics to lean on now. Just the man and the page, the same page she had held aloft before. The sight of them together, human and invoice, story and cost, tightened the room until even the hum of the lights seemed to quiet out of respect. He cleared his throat once, and the small sound traveled like a signal to stay silent. His first words came thin with nerves but clean with intention, and then they carried, filling the chamber without strain. "I voted for her, and this is how she repaid me," he said, breaking the sentence in the middle, as if the memory itself had put a hand on his shoulder. And though the line was simple, it struck with the force of a verdict because it contained a full exchange. Trust given, promise made, promise broken, delivered not by a pundit or a poll, but by the person who had paid the price. The reaction unfolded in layers and then was gone, like wind that rises and dies in a single sweep. A quick ripple of murmurs skittered across the upper rows. A few sharp intakes of breath slipped free. Pens that had been scribbling stopped on the same beat, and then all the noise collapsed into a dead silence so complete that shifting fabric sounded loud. Faces that had been skeptically tight went slack. Shoulders that had braced for more, theater dropped an inch, and even the reporters who lived for noise lowered their chins and simply watched, as if the room itself had decided that any sound would be disrespectful to the truth that had just landed. Across the table, MTG's posture told its own story. Head bowing first by degrees and then all the way down, eyes refusing to meet the man's, then refusing to meet anyone's, fingers that had fussed with a stack of papers going still, knuckles whitening around the edges as if the paper could anchor a seat that suddenly felt unmoored. She looked not left or right, but only at the surface in front of her, a fixed point that promised nothing. And the cameras, ruthless and patient, found the angle that showed it all. The deliberate avoidance, the turned face, the posture of someone shrinking from the gaze of a witness. The man didn't add to his sentence, and he didn't need to. The pause that followed belonged to him, not because of volume, but because of ownership. And in that pause, the bill in his hand stopped being mere evidence and became a ledger of choices, line items of appropriations denied, votes cast against clinics and coverage, abstractions that had bled into his life, while his left hand, the one not gripping the paper, opened and closed once at his side, a small human tick that said the hardest part of speaking isn't always the speaking but the standing still afterward. Jasmine kept her place a half step behind the mic, not a savior and not a shield, simply present in a way that steadied the ground. One palm rested lightly on the edge of the lectern, fingertips relaxed, her gaze shifting from the man's profile to the committee in front of them, and back again, wordless but emphatic about who deserved the center of the frame, and the message spread without a syllable. This was not a performance, not a trap, not a stunt. It was testimony, and the room would treat it that way. The silence thickened into shape, less a void than a substance with weight, and within it everything became unmistakable. The man standing with a bill no one could wish away, the lawmaker who had looked down rather than up, the congresswoman who had arranged the space and then refused to crowd it. Chairs that had angled toward Jasmine now squared fully in her direction. Pens lifted again, but slowly, almost reverently, as if committing a scene to record rather than filing copy. And the moderator, sensing the futility of his gavel against what had taken hold, let his hand fall still while the chamber absorbed the sentence that would echo long after the lights cooled and the microphones clicked off. The hush that followed the man's testimony didn't dissolve. It hardened, and into that charged quiet, Jasmine leaned toward her mic with a measured breath and a low, steady cadence that signaled not a victory lap, but the start of the next move, pausing just long enough for the gallery to still. Before she said, "I am introducing an immediate amendment to the federal insurance statute to guarantee treatment for every tax-paying citizen," then lifted a thin blue folder, slid a one-page summary to the clerk, and nodded to the moderator as staffers stepped closer with clipboards, the chamber's focus snapping to her as if pulled by a cable, the emotional gravity shifting from outrage to action in a single, seamless beat. She did not sell it with flourish. She read it like a contract with the country, crisp and plain. Automatic eligibility for emergency and life-saving care for all tax filers and dependents. A 72-hour mandatory approval clock on medically necessary procedures. A hard cap on out-of-pocket costs for seniors and for households under defined income thresholds. Full continuity of coverage during job loss, disaster declarations, or hospital transfers. No rescission for pre-existing conditions, ever. Rural stability grants to reopen shuttered clinics and keep trauma centers staffed past midnight. Mobile units funded to bridge the miles where hospitals have disappeared. Enforcement teeth for denials that bury families in appeals, and a pay for that didn't duck the math. Closing the carve-out that let third-party administrators siphon fees off denied claims, clawing back dormant procurement surcharges, and redirecting a slice of fraud recoveries back into the care side, all written in language designed to outlive a news cycle and stand up in court. The clerk began to stamp the submission time, the sudden percussion of bureaucracy popping like small firecrackers under the ceiling. And Jasmine kept speaking in the same even tone that had shattered the room minutes ago, adding that the amendment would prioritize veterans' access to specialty care without a second round of referrals, would require real-time price transparency for the 10 most common inpatient procedures, and would compel insurers to report quarterly denial data by zip code and age band so that no region could quietly bleed without the numbers calling out the wound. A scaffolding of details that gave spine to the promise and made each line feel less like aspiration and more like instructions someone was about to carry out. Pens clicked, heads tilted. Staffers leaned into the aisles with forms. The moderator, sensing the surge, adjusted his glasses and yielded the floor for a reading of the short title, the Taxpayer Treatment Guarantee Amendment, while Jasmine lifted a second sheet and said, "Co-sponsor list is open." And the sergeant-at-arms, who minutes earlier had been a traffic cop for raised voices, now became a courier for signatures, moving the clipboard down the row as a camera operator, breathing shallow, tightened the frame on the first name that dared to cross the line from theater to law. A senior member from across the aisle stood first, the scrape of his chair a clean punctuation mark, and took the pen without speech or show, his signature long and unadorned. A second lawmaker followed before the clip reached him, stepping forward to reach it faster, and then a third, an appropriations veteran who had sparred with Jasmine for years, put her name down with a fast, angled hand, glancing once at the gallery, once at the man still holding his bill, and then back to Jasmine as if to say that on some days a vote isn't a calculation, but a mirror, the line of ink drying as quickly as the room's new reality. What happened next looked like choreography, only because conviction is contagious. A conservative from a rural district asked for a copy of the Rural Stability Grant language, scanned the paragraph about keeping the nearest trauma bay funded through low-volume months, and signed. A freshman who had campaigned on austerity read the pay-for twice, asked a staffer to confirm the closed loophole didn't raise premiums, then signed with a tight jaw and a nod. A border state libertarian, typically a no on anything that smells like expansion, took the pen after whispering, "My people drive 90 miles for a bed. That ends," and added his name with 3 quick strokes as if cutting a cord. Around them, the gallery's tension recalibrated from shock to attention. Phones stayed down, eyes stayed up, and the only sounds threading the air were the soft pass of paper against wood, the controlled clicks of pens uncapped and recapped, the rubbery thump of the clerk's stamp marking, time in a rhythm that felt like a pulse returning to a limb that had gone numb, while Jasmine held her ground a step back from the center, as if the amendment needed the room more than it needed her. Hands folded, mouth set, gaze steady, refusing to ride the moment and choosing to hold it instead. "Read the enforcement section," someone across the dais asked, and the counsel did, laying out civil penalties for bad faith denials, expedited injunctive relief for patients caught in limbo, a whistleblower lane for claims adjusters ordered to delay to deny, and a federal trigger that would activate provisional coverage when state grids failed, each clause carrying the plain-spoken finality of lines hammered into steel. And when the reading ended, no one clapped, because applause would have cheapened the shift that was already happening in the bloodstream of the place. A cluster of opposition members, faces that had been tight, wary, hostile an hour earlier, formed a small, unplanned queue behind the clipboard, flipping pages, asking what the income cap meant for working seniors, what the 72-hour clock did to ER spillover, how the fraud recovery redirect would be walled off from raids in lean budget years. Answers came fast, unvarnished, specific, and the staffers beside Jasmine slid forward exhibits like technicians, cycling trays in an operating room, each document landing with the satisfying, low slap of a tool reaching the exact hand that had called for it, and somewhere in the back row, a reporter mouthed, "I've never seen this," to no one and everyone, because scenes like this do not happen in this town unless something heavier than politics has taken the wheel. By the time the clipboard completed its first lap, The signatures spilled past the party line and into territory that rarely sees ink on the same page. The names aligning in a column that read like a truce crafted in an emergency. And it was not dramatics that marked the moment, but the absence of them. No raised voices, no barbed asides, no victory stares, only the quiet mechanics of government doing what it pretends it always does, solving the problem in front of it. While the man with the $120,000 bill stayed standing near the aisle, one knuckle pressed white against the paper's edge, watching the pen move from hand to hand, and the moderator finding his gavel moot, let his fingers rest beside it as the chamber, for once, wrote itself into a better shape. The signatures were still drying when the chamber's energy settled into a held breath, the kind that comes right before a verdict is spoken aloud. Jasmine stood exactly where she'd been throughout the fight, shoulders set, hands relaxed at her sides, eyes steady. Staffers eased back from the dais, clipboards pressed to their chests like shields they no longer needed. The moderator's gavel hovered over wood and never fell, as if even procedure understood that ceremony would only dilute what was about to happen. Camera red lights steadied along the back wall, lenses drawing inward until every frame found her face. The man with the hospital bill remained near the aisle, the paper still gripped in his hand as if it were a passport back into dignity. Across the panel, a few lawmakers adjusted their nameplates unconsciously, aligning brass with fingertips that finally stopped shaking. The recorder sat quiet now, its work complete, its single captured sentence still echoing in the timbre of everyone's breath. That echo moved through the chamber like a tide turning, strong enough to carry the moment onto the next shore without anyone saying a word. And then Jasmine turned, not to the committee, not to her opponent, but to the camera that looked straight through the room and into every living room willing to listen. She did not raise her chin nor square herself like a performer. She simply faced the lens and let the lights find her. The room thinned away behind the glass, leaving her and the country on the other side of it in a one-to-one conversation. Her voice arrived low and clear, the kind of tone that never asked for the floor because the floor already belongs to it. Today we have seen the difference between serving power and serving people. I choose people. The words were simple, but they landed like iron, each clause carrying a clean line between what had broken and what must be built. She did not blink after she said it. She let the camera hold her eyes and measure the steadiness there. In the wings, a staffer's hand paused halfway to a pocket, the instinct to check a phone interrupted by the sense that a line worth remembering had just been spoken. A lawmaker on the far end exhaled through his nose and nodded once without meaning to, acknowledging a standard that had just been publicly set. The silence that followed did not collapse. It crowned the statement and set it in place. The first clap came from the upper gallery, fast and clean, cutting the quiet like a starter's pistol. A second landed from the staff row, and then a third and fourth, overlapping until the sound became a single sheet of force rolling toward the dais. Chairs scraped back, fabric rustled, and the entire chamber rose as one. The kind of standing ovation that isn't about spectacle, but about recognition. Hands met hands again and again, building a rhythm that lived outside any party line and outside anyone's talking points. The moderator did not try to tamp it down. His hand fell from the gavel, and he joined, palms coming together with the startled relief of someone who has been granted an honest minute in a room that rarely allows it. It went on longer than applause usually does in a place allergic to sincerity, long enough for faces to open and hard angles to soften. The sound folded the ceiling down toward the floor and pushed the walls back, making space where there had been none all afternoon. It was not loud because it was rehearsed. It was loud because it was earned. By the time it began to fade, almost a full minute had moved through the room, and not a single person sat early. Jasmine did not bow and did not soak it in. She gave the ovation a small nod. Thanks, not victory. And then stepped off the riser with the quiet confidence of someone who knows what comes after a promise. Security shifted instinctively to make a lane, but they did not need to. The crowd widened on its own, leaving an aisle straight to the man with the bill. She took the steps carefully, not because her legs were unsteady, but because the moment deserved no stumble of pace or pride. The steady thud of her heels matched the last pockets of clapping, until both sounds settled into a shared hush. When she reached him, she did not pat his shoulder or deliver words for the camera. She extended her hand, palm open, level with his. He met it with both of his, rough knuckles closing around her fingers, with a gratitude that was half relief and half return. The paper crinkled between his wrist and chest, loud enough to be caught by the boom mic, loud enough to remind everyone that this hadn't been theory. The sergeant-at-arms took a half step forward and then stopped, recognizing he was watching the safest thing in the room. The lead cameraman, who had spent a career chasing angles that made noise look like meaning, found the frame without hunting. He slid the focus down from the dais to the handshake, catching both faces in a clean diagonal. Her eyes steady and unyielding, his eyes rimmed and shining but unbroken. A junior operator to the left lowered his shoulder and took a knee to lock the shot against the edge of the aisle, setting the patient's folded bill in the lower third and Jasmine's expression in the upper. The director in the truck whispered, "Hold it," and the gallery microphones settled into the air like they had been hung there for the single image and nothing else. Light pooled on the backs of their hands, highlighting the plain dignity of skin over bone, the map of veins that tell a simpler story than any press release. A lawmaker from the back row, who had not clapped quickly, pressed her lips into a line and let her arms fall to her sides, recognizing that there are moments a vote can only follow. The stillness did not stagnate. It breathed, small and regular, and the camera drank it in. The red tally light never wavered. From the dais, the people who had signed found themselves looking at the scene like a mirror, each wondering how long it had been since they had touched a constituent's hand without a reflex to calculate the optics. A member who had not signed yet reached for the clipboard again, found a pen, and added his name with a short, angled signature, then let the pen lie at the bottom of the page without the usual cap. Two others shifted their chairs to face the aisle fully, abandoning the choreography of partisan proximity for the more basic geometry of witness. A counsel who had spent the afternoon guarding commas and subclauses leaned in to whisper to a colleague, but then didn't, choosing to watch instead. The clerk, still stamping submission times, slowed the tempo as if to avoid smudging something that had nothing to do with ink. None of them were part of the shot, but all of them were inside it. The hearing had not ended. It had simply found its point. Jasmine squeezed the man's hands once, a pressure that said only what needed saying: "The system hurt you, and it will not touch you alone again." She released, but she did not step back. She remained close enough that the camera had to choose whether to widen or keep the intimacy. The cameraman widened. The frame took both of them in from waist to brow, then took one slow breath wider still, pulling a crescent of lawmakers into the edges as witnesses without letting them eclipse the center. The director in the truck again said, "Hold," and the audio supervisor rode the pot down on the ambient roar until the room sounded like a heart at rest. A reporter in the press row lowered her pen and let the caption write itself in her head without reaching for adjectives. In the highest seats, a pair of tourists who had found their way into the gallery by accident realized they had wandered into history and stood straight-backed with their hands lightly clasped. A page, barely out of college, glanced from the dais to the patient, and then back to Jasmine with the look of someone whose textbook had just become a living thing. There is a particular frequency in a room when a picture turns into an emblem, and it arrived without ceremony. The shot on the main camera held, and the auxiliary camera found a counter angle, the two images laying over each other like interlocked palms. No chyron scrolled because none was needed. The director called for the slow rack focus to shift from their hands to their eyes and then back again, letting the audience feel what the room already knew. A boom mic caught a single cloth rustle as the man folded the bill into his breast pocket, the sound sitting in the mix like punctuation. Jasmine did not look up at the screens. She stayed with him until he had settled the paper and drawn one long breath. The camera, respectful of the finish, lingered half a beat more before the director cut to a wide of the chamber, revealing the full measure of the stand that had been taken. In the truck, silence was its own approval. On the floor, silence was its own consent. The moderator finally set his gavel down flat, palm open beside it, as if conceding that order had become something organic rather than something enforced. He scanned the dais and found assent in inclined heads and tired, honest eyes. The sergeant-at-arms returned to his post, not because the room needed discipline, but because the moment had completed itself. A staffer in the second row wiped at the corner of an eye with the back of a wrist and laughed softly at the reflex, more surprised by the laugh than the tear. A veteran in the gallery brushed his sleeve over the seam on his trousers and stood straighter, the old habit of inspection returning unbidden. The man with the bill patted his pocket once, a gesture so small it would have gone unnoticed without the cameras, and then nodded to Jasmine with a gratitude that did not need words. She answered with a nod of equal size and double weight. Nobody hurried to the next agenda item. In the building's corridors, monitors carried the frame down marble and carpet, the image bleeding from room to room until staff who had not been in the chamber found themselves standing still in doorways. Down on the street, office lobbies that had muted their televisions for years clicked the sound back on without thinking why. In living rooms and waiting rooms, in union halls and church basements, the same still shot began to settle like dust that cleans rather than dirties. There were no lower thirds shouting for attention. The picture did not need a label. The old cynicisms lifted just enough to let the scene through. A child asked a grandparent what was happening, and the grandparent did not answer right away, choosing instead to watch the way two hands can carry as much truth as any speech. Somewhere miles away, a clinic nurse on a break looked up at a mounted screen and felt a piece of the night shift get lighter. Jasmine turned back to the dais only when the moment had finished itself, letting the quiet close like a well-made door. The camera kept her in the edge of frame long enough to catch the return of resolve in her shoulders, a signal that the lines she had drawn with words would be carried in work. She offered the patient a final small nod, then set her gaze on the table where the amendment papers lay stacked like a promise waiting to be notarized by time. The red lights on the cameras softened to stand by, but the image they had captured kept working in the room without electricity. A few seats creaked as people remembered to sit, and even that sounded careful. The witness in the aisle took his place again, pressing both hands flat on his knees before lifting his head, unashamed of the moisture at the corner of each eye. The moderator glanced toward the clock and chose not to speak it into being. The chamber held the silence a breath longer, because it had earned the right to keep it. And somewhere beyond the walls, the frame, the steady eyes, the joined hands, the folded bill, began its long walk across the country, not as a slogan, not as a meme, but as a measure. It moved from newsroom to doorstep, from screen to memory, not because it was designed to be iconic, but because it was true enough to withstand being seen again. Those who watched did not argue about what they had witnessed. They argued instead about what would be required to live up to it, which is the only argument that ever changes anything. The day would end, the lights would cool, the microphones would sleep, and the city would go back to its noise. But the image would keep doing its work in quiet places, the way a seed does when no one is watching. Jasmine had set it to the camera, and the room had confirmed it with its feet. There is a difference between serving power and serving people. And today, in the kind of moment that belongs to anyone willing to claim it, she chose people, and the country chose to notice. The chamber was still thick with the weight of what had just happened. The applause was gone, the cameras had gone dark, but the image of Jasmine standing there, steady, unshaken, was still alive in every mind. This was no longer about a hearing, no longer about a partisan fight. It had shifted into something more raw and personal. A reminder that leadership isn't measured by how well you defend power, but by how far you'll go to defend the powerless. That realization didn't need fanfare. It simply sat in the room, undeniable, pressing against the conscience of everyone who had seen it unfold. The lesson came without a lecture. Today we have seen the difference between serving power and serving people. I choose people, she had said. It wasn't a crafted slogan. It was the truth, stripped bare, standing on its own legs. And that truth carried weight because it was backed by action, by a moment where she had something to lose and still refused to step back. Even those who had come in ready to oppose her could feel it. This wasn't politics as usual. This was the cost of courage paid in full, right in front of them. Outside the spectacle, the meaning deepened. Somewhere, a father was staring at an unopened medical bill, thinking of the patient in that chamber who finally had someone fight for him. Somewhere else, a young staffer, jaded by months of party line maneuvering, had just seen proof that politics could still have a heartbeat. The lesson was simple and brutal. If you stand for the powerless long enough, power will try to break you. If you stand anyway, you're no longer standing alone. That's not the kind of victory you measure in polls. It's the kind that lodges itself in people's lives. Everyone in that chamber had expected a predictable script: partisan talking points, safe denials, and a neat wrap-up for the evening news. Instead, Jasmine had dropped the kind of truth that burned away excuses. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. She let the facts cut, then let the silence finish the job. And in that silence, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Even those who had every reason to shield MTG found themselves stripped of that comfort, staring straight at the line between loyalty and conscience. That's why the image of her shaking the patient's hand mattered. It wasn't stage. It wasn't for show. It was proof that the fight didn't end when the microphones went cold. It carried the quiet power of someone who doesn't just speak about justice, but practices it when no one's keeping score. For some, it restored the idea that politics could still be human. For others, it was a challenge, forcing them to ask whether they'd have chosen the same if the moment had been theirs. By the time the story started to spread beyond the Capitol, the political angle had already been overtaken by the human one. The footage didn't need editing. The words didn't need spin. People passed it along not because it was sensational, but because it was true. In kitchens, offices, and late-night calls, they weren't talking about legislative strategy. They were talking about a moment when someone with power chose to use it for people who had none. Most of us will never stand in a congressional chamber, but all of us will face moments when we must choose between serving power and serving people. Those moments may be smaller, quieter, unseen by the world, but they are no less defining. The lesson from this day is clear. You are not measured by the position you hold, but by who you choose to protect when it matters most. Jasmine's stand was one moment. The choice to carry it forward belongs to everyone who saw it, and everyone who understands that courage, once witnessed, can never be unseen. The weight of the lesson hung in the air like smoke after a battlefield, thick, inescapable, and demanding a response. Jasmine didn't let it fade. She stepped forward again, voice steady but carrying the force of a hammer striking steel. If this matters to you, don't clap. Act. Call your representatives. Demand they sign this amendment. Don't wait for someone else to fix what you can fight for today. Her words cut through the chamber, sharp and unflinching, pulling every listener into the moment. Because if they can deny care to him, they can deny it to you. And the day you need help will be too late to start caring. The silence that followed wasn't passive. It was the kind that coils, ready to move. Eyes locked on her, not because she was performing, but because she had just placed the responsibility into every pair of hands in that room. This isn't a spectator sport, she said finally. This is your country. Stand up for it. And with that, the room felt less like an audience and more like an army waiting for its first order. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.